Good afternoon. This is Gonul Tol with the VantagePoint at the Middle East Institute. I'm very happy to have Sinan Ulgen with us today. Sinan, he's a visiting scholar at Carnegie Europe in Brussels, where his research focuses on Turkish foreign policy, nuclear policy, and transatlantic relations. He's also the chairman of the Center for Economics and Foreign Policy Studies, an independent think tank in Istanbul. He has served in the Turkish Foreign Service in Ankara, on the United Nations desk in Brussels, at the Turkish Permanent Delegation to the European Union, and at the Turkish Embassy in Tripoli. He's a regular contributor to Turkish dailies, and his opinion pieces have been published in the International New York Times, the Financial Times, and the Wall Street Journal. Sinan, thank you. I know this is a busy day for you. Thanks for taking the time. Let's start with President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's most recent meeting with EU officials. It was the first face-to-face meeting between top Brussels officials and Erdogan since he narrowly won the vote in April on giving him extra powers. And relations have soured badly over the Turkish president's increasingly authoritarian actions. And in the run-up to the referendum, his anti-European rhetoric and his threat to impose the death penalty have not helped. And in the meantime, in Turkey, Europe is regarded with deep suspicion, and Europeans are also skeptical. So, but the meeting seems to have partially diffused tensions. European Commission spokesperson after the meeting said, and I quote, "The EU and Turkey must and will continue to cooperate. Major issues of common interest have been discussed in detail in a good, constructive atmosphere." And after the meeting, Erdogan similarly said Turkey does not aim to break away from the EU, but he also added that the EU cannot see Turkey as a beggar at its door. So what is your take on the meeting? Is a reset for Turkey-EU relations possible?
Under current circumstances, I don't really see much room for a reset. This has to do with the domestic situation in Turkey, but it also has to do with the political environment in Europe. What the leadership has achieved is essentially to avert a collapse of the relationship. Yes, this was a constructive meeting, but we really have to see much more concrete movement to be able to state with clarity that the Turkey-EU relationship is now moving in a good direction. What can be said, however, is that surely President Erdogan has backtracked from his much more hawkish and aggressive attitude and rhetoric towards the EU, which he had adopted during the referendum campaign. He seems now more intent on convincing his counterparts in Europe that they would have to leave that behind and that a new relationship must be structured. But this is going to be, this will require serious effort and commitment on the side of the Turkish government. And it's going to be also quite difficult to achieve these objectives at a time when emergency rule is still in place. That seems to be a real stumbling block in terms of moving Turkey's relationship with Europe forward. One of the core components, core features of those discussions was given that there is really realistically little hope for the political relationship to move forward, namely the accession track has stalled, and under these circumstances it is not going to be revitalized. There was at least an effort to try to see whether other components of the relationship can be at least targeted as a new benchmark. One of those is the revitalization of the customs union, and that is going to be a milestone for 2017, which will indicate whether the relationship can actually progress.
Well, indeed, there are voices both in Europe and Turkey calling for a shift towards a more pragmatic approach, a new framework in the fields of trade and security. And as you mentioned, upgrading the existing customs union would be a step in that direction. But there might not even be enough support among EU members to move forward with it.
Yes.
So do you think the European countries are ready for a purely transactional relationship with Turkey?
No, I don't. In that sense, it's different from Turkey's relationship with the US. The aspiration in Ankara, and perhaps with Erdogan and his advisors, may indeed be that Turkey now should move in a purely transactional direction in a relationship that's essentially underpinned by an economic track and disassociate itself from any political leverage that the accession track involves. But from the EU's perspective, that may not be a very realistic proposal. The EU may not be ready to totally disassociate its political inclinations from the economic agenda that Turkey wants to build. And this is currently also reflects also the discussion within Europe about how to move forward with Turkey. Because since we're talking about the customs union, there are here two opposing camps in Europe. One camp led by countries like Austria, Holland, but that's also the position of the European Parliament, wants the decision to move forward with the customs union negotiations to be accompanied by political conditionality, namely by concrete improvements on the rule of law, by freeing the journalists, by ending the emergency rule, and so on. There is another camp that believes that there is no real need to impose ex-ante political conditionality, so no need to front-load the relationship, but these are issues that can be tackled during the negotiations and perhaps at the end of the negotiations. So this very much also reflects the divisions within Europe about how to deal with Turkey.
What is the tendency, though? I mean, how strong is the camp? Because I mean, those who are extremely concerned about the state of Turkish democracy, they have high expectations from Turkey's EU membership process. And that's why they're praising European efforts to continue to talk to Turkey. Despite the displeasure, despite the tension in Turkey-EU relations, European countries are still, they don't want to formally suspend the talks. And I believe it's a wise decision, and I know that many in Turkey feel the same way. But they also urged European countries to attach those political conditions to the negotiations. What is your take on that? Is it possible, should the EU, from the European perspective, should the EU be doing that? Or let me put it another way, does the EU have any leverage? Can the EU influence Turkey's political trajectory as many hope in
I think it's too late. There certainly was a period where had the EU been forthcoming, had it embraced Turkey in the manner that it had embraced some countries in Central and Eastern Europe that ended up being EU members, the EU had that leverage, had that transformative impact. Now, unfortunately, we're at a place where the EU has very little leverage. Because the credibility of the accession process has been very largely daunted. And the Turkish government has very little interest in engaging at the level of the political norms with Europe. So what remains, realistically speaking, this I'm talking about short and medium term. I mean, long term things can change. But today, this is the situation. The Turkish government is more interested in building up an economic relationship with Europe. So the leverage is indeed on the side of the type of economic package that will be designed. However, there also the caution, there must be a degree of caution in the sense that we can't replace the political conditionality inherent in the accession process and the transformative impact that the accession process could have had, and just transpose that to an economic relationship. So there can be some conditionality, but it will be much lighter than the accession track, and therefore expectations about what can be achieved by incorporating political conditionality in the economic relationship must also be very, very different from what the accession relationship could have provided.
So what is your, I mean, that's what we heard from officials in Brussels, especially after the latest meeting. They have this wait and see approach. They really want to see how the strategy that Erdogan will pick in the coming days with regards to the freedom of speech, rule of law. So realistically, what is the expectation? I mean, moving forward, what should we expect from this relationship in the short term?
Well, I think the only thing that we can realistically expect under current circumstances is essentially a green light to move forward with the economic aspect of the relationship. Also a desire to protect the other components of the relationship. There is a refugee deal that's in place. But that is realistically speaking what we can expect in current circumstances. It's only after Turkey decides firmly to improve its record on democratic norms, the rule of law, that we can more realistically talk about revitalizing the accession path.
Do you see that happening?
It could. I mean, that's the reason why, like you, I was averse to the prospect of the formal suspension of the negotiations, because that's in a way the nuclear option, in the sense that once this decision is taken, a defreeze requires unanimity, which essentially means that any country, be it Cyprus, Luxembourg, Austria, can block the restart of the negotiations. That's why the informal freeze, which is the current status, is more manageable as a diplomatic arrangement rather than a formal suspension.
And we have little time, so I want to also talk about NATO. Turkish president had invited the leaders of NATO member countries to Istanbul for the 2018 summit during their meeting in Warsaw in July 2016. And at the time, the leaders had informally agreed. But just yesterday, according to a German newspaper, a group of European countries led by Germany, France, the Netherlands, and Denmark said that they opposed the annual summit being held in Turkey after a downturn in relations between the EU and Turkey. And a high-ranking NATO diplomat talked to the newspaper, and he said that they did not want to enhance Turkey's international credentials, and they want to avoid the impression that NATO supports the Turkish government's internal policy. What can you say about the state of Turkey-NATO relations?
Well, the Turkey-NATO relations is affected by the downturn in Turkey's bilateral relations with individual governments in Europe. And we certainly have seen some very difficult episodes during the referendum campaign, particularly with the Netherlands, but also with Germany. But there are also other bilateral difficulties with these governments. With Germany in particular, Turkey has been very critical of the stance of these governments to give refugee status to people who are linked to the Gülen organization. As a result, Turkey decided to impose restrictions on the visit of German parliamentarians to the Incirlik air base. And this has really led to an escalation, which is now certainly being detrimental to Turkey's prospects in international organizations as well, like NATO. Turkey has also blocked some of NATO's cooperation programs because it includes Austria, and the relationship with Austria is also pretty bad. So what we're seeing is that these bilateral difficulties are now being transposed in multilateral settings. That's basically how I interpret the decision yesterday.
And also, I don't know if this factored into the calculations of NATO member countries, Turkey's decision to purchase Russian S-400. Because there is this talk among both among NATO member countries and also in Washington that Turkey is turning to Russia, and in a way signaling to the Western world that it has other options. Do you see that viable?
No, I don't see it viable. I don't find it credible either. I think surely Turkey as a sovereign nation could decide to improve its relationship with Russia. There are areas where this would be of mutual benefit, and we've seen some of those in the area of tourism, energy collaboration, even technology transfer. You know, these are certainly areas where we can see these type of improvements. But there will always be a limit as to how close Ankara's relationship with Moscow can ever become. There are, historical reasons for this. There are ideological reasons for this, and therefore Turkey may indeed signal through its relationship with Russia its displeasure to the West on a number of issues. But fundamentally, we have to be realistic about this. This by no means is a message that Turkey could find an alternative to where it sits today in terms of its security relationship with the West, its economic relationship with the West, its cultural relationship with the West. So really, very briefly, Russia has very little to offer to replace these very deep relationship ties that the Turkish Republic has built over so many years with the West.
And there's skepticism in Moscow too. I mean,
as well, yeah.
So with regard to Turkey-NATO relations, and my final question, actually, I think this might indicate what comes next in Turkey's relations with the West. There's a lot of pressure on Merkel to withdraw troops from Incirlik. So speaking of alternatives, she said that Jordan could be an alternative. Do you see that happening? I mean, the elections are coming up in Germany, so that might be one of the reasons why Merkel had that statement. And Turkey was saying, if they decide to leave, there is nothing we can do about that. Do you think it will come to that, or will the countries have a more measured response? Because this could, again, if Germany decides to move troops to another location, to Jordan, for instance, this could set a precedent for other countries, because Turkey has been using Incirlik as a leverage.
Sure, but it's also a very bad signal. At the end of the day, Turkey is a NATO country. So hosting NATO troops as part of the anti-IS campaign in Incirlik is, by extension, a signal of solidarity with the alliance. So if one alliance member, due to political differences, decides to move its troops to a non-NATO country, that already is a signal that the cohesion within NATO has been greatly harmed due to difficulties over bilateral relationships. But of course, there is a political and electoral backdrop to this discussion as well, as you've certainly pointed out. So there is hope that after the September elections in Germany, some of these difficulties can be resolved. But again, it's not a foregone conclusion. The other scenario is also equally likely, that after the elections, a new government, depending on the nature of the government, may become more hawkish on the relationship with Turkey.
Well, thank you very much for your time, and thank you for being with us. This has been the Vantage Point for the Middle East Institute.
Thank you again.